Welcome to the fifth in a series of noon lectures to be sponsored by the Associated Student Speakers Program. As you are well aware, this week has been devoted to Peace Corps recruiting activities. We are very fortunate to have with us today a member of the Peace Corps staff, Mr. Frank Mankiewicz. Mr. Mankiewicz has been the Peace Corps Regional Director for Latin America. As of April 1964, he has been in charge of program developments and operations for 17 countries. Prior to this, he directed the Peace Corps program in Peru for over 2 years. The topic about which Mr. Mankiewicz will speak on is the role of the Peace Corps in the new student movement. At this time, it is a distinct honor to present to you Mr. Frank Mankiewicz.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. You suppose this works? Very happy to be back here at UCLA, which I attended many years ago. I was the editor of the Daily Bruin at one time, and I'm very pleased to see that among the items of continuity on this campus that has changed so dramatically in the past 18 years, that at least the Daily Bruin remains a constant. The Bruin has had the opportunity now in the past 2 days to write stories about this speech and about my coming here, and I am pleased to say that they have spelled my name in 3 different ways in those 2 days, all of them wrong. Just as when we were undergraduates at UCLA, we made it a point of honor never to schedule classes in the afternoon in the spring, or on Thursdays at all, or above the first floor, or in a class that required the use of the reserve book room. So on the Daily Bruin, we made it our policy never to write stories about people whose names had more than 2 syllables. And that way, we achieved a remarkable record of accuracy, and I think won a few typographical awards. I'm not really annoyed that the Bruin yesterday left a Z off my name and today added a new C, because it shows that it's in the spirit of the student movement of the 1960s, restless, challenging old values, and occasionally inaccurate. I want to talk this morning about the Peace Corps in general, and also about the Peace Corps particularly in Latin America, what it's doing. We think that some of the things I have to say may make some of you change your minds a little bit about what the Peace Corps is doing. And after telling you some general things about what the Peace Corps is up to and what we do in Latin America, I will try to say a few things about some things we've observed about this generation of college students, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. The Peace Corps in Latin America is primarily engaged in what we call community development. And to demonstrate community development, as opposed to some of the other theories of economic development, I would like to tell you a story, because I think it relates to the way in which Peace Corps volunteers function in the underdeveloped world with respect to people who talk about per capita income and rates of economic growth and economic infrastructure and inputs and balance of payments and all the rest of it, and assume that if a certain line on a chart is going up, that there has been improvement, in spite of the fact that the number of people who are starving may also have gone up. And the story has to do with a man who goes into a pet store to buy a talking bird. And those of you who have ever heard me speak before have heard the story, and I will thank you not to tell your neighbors the punchline. The story concerns a man who approaches the owner of a pet store, and he says, "All I want is a bird that can talk." And the man says, "Well, it's very easy. We have this fine bird here, and he talks quite a lot, and we'll be happy to sell him to you." So he sells him the bird and the cage. And the man comes back the next day and he says to the proprietor, you know, that talking bird you sold me does not talk. And the man said, well, it's impossible. I don't understand how that can happen. He said, he talks all the time. He said, you came out there this morning, you took the cover off his cage, and what did he do? And the man said, well, I don't have a cover for the cage. He said, well, you better get a cover because the bird's got to tell night from day and understand that he has an environment that he can understand and appreciate and perhaps vary. So the man buys a cover and he's back the next day and he says, you know, the bird still is not talking. And the man says, well, I find that hard to believe. He says, after you took the cover off the cage and the bird climbed up that ladder, what did he do then? He said, well, I don't have a ladder. He said, you don't have a ladder? He said, you got to have a ladder. He said, the bird has to have some exercise. He has to feel that he's accomplishing something. You don't want him to just walk around the bottom of the cage. So he bought a ladder. But the next day the story was the same. The bird is still not talking. And this time the man said, well, he climbed up the ladder. I know you have a ladder because I sold it to you. He said, and then he tinkled that little bell with his beak and looked at himself in the mirror. And then what happened? He said, well, I don't have a bell and I don't have a mirror. He said, well, that's the reason. He said, you've got to give him that bell. He has to have some method of communicating. He has to understand that this is an interdependent society, and one in which just as you deal with him and perform certain tasks, he can perform certain tasks and communicate in a nonverbal way. And as far as the mirror is concerned, you don't have to buy a mirror. He says you could get another bird. He said, but he has to have some feeling that there's a response in his society. He has to feel that he has an image of himself that he can understand, and also perhaps sense that there are other units in his society beyond himself. This man had a degree in sociology. So he bought the bell and he bought the mirror, and the next day he came back and said that bird is still not talking. 5-6 days had gone by now, and the man said to him, well, you took the cover off his cage and he climbed up that ladder. He said he tinkled the bell, and then he looked in the mirror, and then he walked across that little catwalk you have. I said, no, I don't have a catwalk. He said, well, the bird has to be able to demonstrate his masculinity. He said he's got to have he's got to demonstrate that he is a real person in a real world. And you may think it's showing off, he said, but it's merely a way of demonstrating his individuality, and he's got to have that catwalk or some kind of feat that he can perform. So he sells him a catwalk. And the next day, with the same kind of explanation, he sells him a beak scratcher. And finally the man comes back after he's bought all these things, and he says, you know that talking bird you sold me? He said, well, that bird is dead. And the proprietor says, I don't understand it. What do you mean he's dead? He says, he's dead. Keeled over this morning and died. He said, well, tell me what happened. He said, well, it's very simple. He says, I took the cover off his cage, and he walked up the ladder, and he tinkled a little bell, and he looked at himself in the mirror, and he walked across the catwalk, and he scratched his beak, and then he turned around and died. And the man said, well, didn't he say anything before he died? He said, yes, he did. Ah, he said, he did talk. He said, what did he say? He said, well, just before he died, he said, he turned around and he looked at me, and he said, where is my damn food? Now, the Peace Corps, at least in Latin America, is providing the food. We let others provide the infrastructure and the economic inputs and rely on the standard statistical indicators to show that progress is being made, although we are inclined from time to time in the people-to-people approach of the Peace Corps to suspect that what is needed may be more food and less equipment. It has now been 5 years since President Kennedy stood in the Cow Palace in San Francisco as a candidate for the presidency and proposed that the United States establish a Peace Corps to send volunteer ambassadors abroad. A lot of people have claimed credit for that suggestion, and I think it's probably a sterile debate as to whether that was the day the Peace Corps was first proposed or whether in some form or another others had proposed it before that. The motivation may have been obscure, but the call was very clear, and it remains just as clear today as it was 5 years ago. Since that time, something like 200,000 Americans have volunteered to join the Peace Corps. Some 15,000, a few more than 15,000, have served overseas in 46 countries. There are something over 10,000 presently serving, and something like 4,000 odd now back in the United States, having completed a 2-year tour of Peace Corps service, many of whom perhaps are in this room. Volunteers have served in Africa, in the Far East, in the Near East, in South Asia, and in Latin America. And at the present time, in some African countries, well over half of the primary and secondary students are in school at all because there is a Peace Corps teacher available to teach them. In Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, and throughout the newly independent countries of Africa, the Peace Corps is furnishing a sizable portion, and in some cases a majority, of the teaching force available in those places. In Thailand, in Turkey, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, and in countries whose names were not even known to the people of their own country a few years ago, Peace Corps volunteers are working in a variety of tasks. In Latin America, there are some 4,000 Peace Corps volunteers, 4,185 if anyone is interested in the statistical data, working in 17 countries, and primarily in the area of what we call community development. And it is the Peace Corps work in community development in Latin America that I want to talk about today, because it seems to me to respond, perhaps more than any other kind of Peace Corps service, to the dedications and commitments that animate the American university student of the 1960s. It has been said that this is a college generation that will not take yes for an answer, which I think is not a bad description. I'm not speaking now only about the students taking an active personal role in the problems that they perceive in our society and elsewhere in the world. I think I'm talking about a very broad segment of American university student opinion concerned about real issues, interested in applying in the real world what they are learning in the classroom, and dedicated to something far more than the customary sterile cliches of career building and other forms of self-interest. Whether it was fired by President Kennedy, or whether the Times merely have demanded it and raised these issues to a level of immediate concern on the part of university students, the fact is there. And it is a new generation and a different kind of approach to problems and to the world that we see today in American campuses than we did 10 years ago, or even for that matter, 20 years ago. And the fact that the Daily Bruin persists in an occasional inaccuracy is one of the very few things that remain the same on the American campus. The community development worker with the Peace Corps in Latin America is engaged in nothing more or less than the transformation of the society to which he has gone. If you consider Latin America to be a society in which the vast majority of the population is without a voice and without participation in the social, economic, and political decisions that are made and that concern him, and that the goal of these countries and that the goal of the Peace Corps with them in community development is to change that totally and to create a situation in which these voiceless people with no participation in their country's affairs move into the mainstream of those societies and play an active role in decision making as it affects them and their environment and their lives, then you're talking about a social revolution. You're talking about a situation in which an entire society will be taken apart and reconstructed. And to that task, most of the governments of Latin America have asked the Peace Corps to assist. Now, what does it mean? It means working in remote villages in the Andean Sierra. It means working in the slums of Rio and Recife. It means working among the migrants who have come by the thousands and the hundreds of thousands to the great cities on the west coast of Latin America. It means working in so-called super bloques, giant 1,000 and 2,000 and 4,000 occupant apartment houses in Caracas, in which even the police will not enter, to say nothing of rent collectors. It means working in Panama side by side with animosities and enmities toward our country that have existed and been fanned and inflamed over the generations. It means working in backward areas of Latin America, of Central America, where the word United States has in the past often been synonymous with exploitation. And it means working in some of the most backward and feudal areas of the world. It means working with people who are owned by the same people who own the land they work. And to go into situations like that in the cities and in the rural areas, to participate in the transformation of that society into something approaching a democratic self-governing community, is a task, I think, far beyond that originally thought of as the kind of mission in which the Peace Corps would be engaged. Peace Corps volunteers go to a community like that, and their primary duty is to learn where they are and what they're doing and what the people around them are doing. And it would be hoped that a good community development volunteer will, in 3 or 4 months, know more about that community, first of all, than the people who live there, and secondly, than he does about his own community. You might run over in your mind how much you know about your own community and the one in which you grew up, in terms of where the power is, how old the people are who live there, what the racial composition is, what people read, what they need, what are the things that are talked about, what happens to young people, where do the school teachers come from, who appoints the police, what happens when people die, is there a free hospital and how do you get into it, and all of those things that make up the fabric of life in a Latin American society, or for that matter, in our own. We're not dealing now with a junior year abroad. We're not dealing with a Operation Amigo, or a situation in which we assume that because a man says he is the head of a community, that he is in fact the head of a community. We're talking about a study. We're talking about an attempt to become a part of the fabric of a community in order to understand its problems and to help the people solve them. And it means working without material resources. It means being the first gringo in that area not to come either to take pictures or to extract a profit or to convert to a particular religion or to set up a military fortification. It means being the first North American to come to that community with the idea that you're going to live there, you're going to share those people's way of life, and through that understand their problems and perhaps contribute in some small way or conceivably in a large way to their own solution of what they finally perceive to be their own problems. And that problem generally has a common name. You go to a Latin American community for the first time, and for the first few days people will wonder about you, and they will assume that you're a tourist even though you're not carrying a light meter, and you may not be dressed properly. If you haven't got the seersucker suit, you're not wearing the tourist uniform. But they will say, well, there's another American there, and he's a turista. And after 3 or 4 days, when they see that you're looking for a place to live, they will think maybe you're an anthropologist. Or perhaps a government official of some kind, or perhaps a spy. And after you've lived there for a week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, they will begin gradually to accept that you are, in fact, what you say you are. They will begin to wonder, what is the exploitative technique that you have brought with you, and it will take some time before they realize that there is none. And as they begin to make this realization, as you begin to become part of their life, the answers to the questions that you ask will be different. You go in the first day and ask people, what is the problem in this community? What do you need most? And they will probably tell you hot and cold running water, because they understand very clearly that that's what you need most. And it is an answer which will please you. And you will gradually come to understand that just as the cultural value in northern Anglo-Saxon countries is to tell the truth when asked a question, the value in Latin societies is to please the asker of the question. And you will learn that there is not necessarily something better or worse about either response, but rather that it is different and must be respected. And so people will tell you what they think you want to hear, and they will tell you they need hot and cold running water and municipal bathhouses and showers. And after a while, they will realize that that isn't necessarily the answer you want, and they will probably tell you that they need schools. Everybody needs schools. That's very safe. But when you have come to be a member of that community, and they trust you and rely on you and observe that you are eating the same food, drinking the same water, fighting for the same sparse cuts of meat at the market, reading the same newspapers, watching the same political slogans appear on the walls and perhaps be affected by their impact, then they will come to confide in you and tell you what the real need is in their community, and the word for that is inevitably justice. Nothing more nor less than that, by which they mean the need to be treated in precisely the same way as others are treated in their larger community and nation. And when you've gotten that answer, you are prepared to examine a little further some of the ways in which the problems of the community can be met. And they can be met by organization, by a sense of community. I've spoken to a couple of political science and other classes here this week and have said that community development, as the Peace Corps practices it in Latin America, is a lot closer to precinct work than it is to social work. And that while it might be defined in sociological terms as a method by which the avenues to power are opened, it can also be described as an understanding that the wheel that squeaks the loudest gets the grease. And community development in Latin America might be said to involve teaching some very small wheels to squeak, because governments are responsive. Governments in Latin America are increasingly responsive to the expressed, organized needs of their communities, and indeed they have asked us to do this work. So that when you've got a community to the point where they can recognize their problems, when you understand yourself what the power structure is and how decisions are made or could be made, and organize people for whatever purpose, to build a school or level a playground or purify some water or come to a class to learn new ways of dealing with cornmeal or whatever it may be, you then have the kernel of what you're looking for. You have the beginnings of a community, of a society. You have the kind of local organization that commentators about the United States have spoken about and marveled about for 100 years. Strong, local self-government, by which all of the authorities from de Tocqueville on down certainly did not mean strong mayors and interesting city councils and boards of supervisors. Nobody, I think, has ever said that the strength of the United States lay in its mayors and city councils. Indeed, we know very well that that is, in many ways, our weakness. What they're talking about is self-organization at the level of the PTA, of the bowling league, of the carpool, which is a marvelous political device when you think about it. A carpool represents nothing more than the perception of a small community of its needs and the quick application through democratic procedures. I'll drive today, you drive tomorrow, he'll drive the next day, of a way to solve that problem. Well, I assure you that that kind of thing is unknown in the underdeveloped area. I'm not talking now about the automobile. I'm talking about the spirit that creates a carpool, that makes people trust and rely upon others in their society to join them in meeting a problem. And in a society characterized by deception and exploitation for hundreds of years, characterized by a level of economic development so low that it is imperceptible, you will not find a situation in which I will drive you to work today and rely on you to drive me to work tomorrow. And yet, all over Latin America, this spirit is beginning to emerge. Wherever Peace Corps volunteers are at work, they find signs that this is beginning to develop. It cannot be said, and I will not say here or anywhere else, that we have been successful in this endeavor. I am not at all sure that if the Peace Corps were to leave Latin America tomorrow, every one of the 4,180 volunteers, that life would not be precisely the same as it was in 1960. But I doubt it. I think we have sown some seeds, opened some windows, and perhaps given to people who don't even realize it a sense of their own importance and of their own ability to solve their own problems. Because the social revolution in Latin America will not come by imposition from the outside. It will not come from the United States saying, we will gladly give you $2 billion if you will only change your social structure. It will come only from a realization by the people on the scene, in the villages and in the slums, that they have the power to affect their own environment and the tools with which to do it. And the job of the Peace Corps in community development in Latin America is to increase that sense of awareness and to show people where the tools are. And once they're on that path, there's not much you can do about it. We have had experience in the United States of people in democratic societies, small cities, states, who have made the wrong decision from time to time. And there are communities in Latin America which will do the same thing. Democracy, after all, does not guarantee good government, only self-government. President Coolidge once said, I'm always very happy to tell this story about President Coolidge, because so far as I know, it's the only story about President Coolidge. And some of his political advisors said to him one day, because his program was having a lot of trouble in Congress, I know that's hard to believe, but that's the story. And they said, you know, Mr. President, there are a lot of SOBs in Congress, and we ought to do something about it. And Coolidge thought for a moment, and then said, well, you know, there are a lot of them in the country, and they're entitled to representation. And that's a fact that people have to keep in mind when they're talking about self-government. We had some Peace Corps volunteers in a Latin American country working in an Indian community, and you have to understand that in Latin America, Indians do not own land. They work land and are owned by others. But this community owned its own land. They had bought it. They had formed a self-governing council, and they governed themselves. And they earned revenue from the sale of potatoes, and they decided whether to buy a truck with that money or buy more fertilizer, and when to plant their potatoes and when to market them and what to charge. And the Peace Corps had been there for 2 years and helped them set up a co-op, taught them some things, I think, about parliamentary procedure, decision-making, elections, self-government, and all the rest. And one day, in their own Indian language, using their best parliamentary procedures, the village council got together, and one of the decisions they made, employing the tools of self-government, was to throw out the Peace Corps. They gave us 24 hours to leave. Someone had told them that we were about to steal their land. Turned out to be erroneous information, and indeed a few months later, having discovered that it was erroneous, they asked us back. But a lot of people assumed that that was a great defeat for the Peace Corps, and we saw a lot of newspaper headlines to that effect. Well, you look what happens. You go in and help those people, and are they grateful? No, they're not. They throw you out. But it seemed to me, and it seemed to the Peace Corps volunteers, who do not include gratefulness as one of the indicia of effectiveness, that it was not a defeat for the Peace Corps at all, but a great triumph. Because where else in Latin America will an Indian group in its own language, in control of its own affairs, feel so confident of its ability to run its own affairs that it will vote to expel gringos? Unheard of. And indeed, the decision was righted later on, but it wouldn't have mattered whether it had been or not, because that community was now a self-governing community. It is listened to. It has an economic impact. It can make decisions that affect the lives and welfare and ultimately the social mobility of every inhabitant in the community. And that is a successful community development project, and it is one to which we invite all of you, if you are interested, to help participate. Now, how is this relevant to today's student movement? Simply this, I think. That the American university student who is concerned and involved, not only in his own society but in the world, has an opportunity through the Peace Corps to perform the individual act that is increasingly becoming the sign of his own commitment. And I think the Peace Corps would say to the American university community that you have demonstrated your concern, you have demonstrated your involvement, you have demonstrated your commitment through participation in democratic movements on your own campuses, through participation in the civil rights movement, through the very kind of community development we're talking about, not only in the urban centers of the North in mobilizing the poor, but in Mississippi and Alabama in organizing, mobilizing, and attempting to give self-governing strength to communities as alienated and as fragmented as any in Latin America. By that you have demonstrated your commitment and your concern. The Peace Corps offers an opportunity for a further demonstration of that commitment and concern and of participation as an individual in the affairs of your country in this century. I am not prepared to say that among the alternatives available to concerned, dedicated, committed university graduates, the Peace Corps is the best thing to do as against, let's say, a continued involvement in the civil rights movement. I am only saying that it presents for this generation of university students a viable alternative which we hope that you will consider, and one which I think will continue the kind of development that you have started yourself, and by working in community development in Latin America, or by teaching school in Nigeria, by participating in the affairs of a community and a culture removed from your own, but one whose problems you understand are inextricably involved with your own, you will be enriching your own life and that of your society. President Kennedy, in his call for the Peace Corps, and in later applications of that principle, said that the energy and the strength and the devotion that we bring to this enterprise can light our country and all who serve it. And I cannot think of a better description of Peace Corps service than that. You can enrich your life and your society by acting upon the principles and the commitments and the goals that you have set for yourselves. I assure you that you can do it in the Peace Corps, and I hope that a great many of you will take advantage of the opportunity that it offers. Now, I will be happy at this time to answer any questions that you may have. I understand that most of you are going to want to get out and get to your classes. Please don't feel that you're in any way insulting me or the Peace Corps if you do that over the next 5 or 10 minutes, but I would hope that some of you might have some questions that I might answer. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question, I'm sorry, go ahead. The first question was that the questioner has heard that in some cases you can teach in a state system upon return from the Peace Corps if your work in the Peace Corps involved teaching or an instructional situation. And the answer is yes, as far as California is concerned. I cannot speak for any other state, but in the state of California, if you have a bachelor's degree and competence in the subject matter you propose to teach, you can, upon a showing that you served 2 years in the Peace Corps as a teacher, begin to teach in the California schools immediately upon your return from Peace Corps service. How many of you did not know that? Well, it's true. Legislation passed last year provides that California school systems will accept, as teachers, without a credential, Peace Corps veterans who served 2 years as a teacher in the Peace Corps. And you then have, I think, 5 years to satisfy those requirements and take those courses, which I will not characterize at this time. But it is true that you can go in the Peace Corps and serve 2 years as a teacher and come back and teach in the California schools without one course in educational theory. As to the second question about using Peace Corps service to reduce NDEA loans, I'm sorry to say I can't answer that. But I will see that you get an answer. If you will come up here afterward and give me your address and where I can direct an answer to, I will let you know. I just don't know the answer. I didn't even know NDEA loans could be reduced by service as a teacher. All right. All right. Yes, ma'am. Well, I don't know. The question refers to an open-end program with David Susskind in which some Peace Corps teachers said they they felt that with only a bachelor's degree in teaching overseas, some of them in universities, that they lacked the supervision of full-time faculty people? Well, I can't answer that. It may be that some of them have had that problem. I know that the students, ex-students who have been teaching in the Peace Corps in Latin American universities are doing quite well and don't seem to feel that need. But it may be that in some of the African teaching situations they do, but I can't go any further than that. But it's not a common complaint. I haven't heard it very much. Yes, sir. Immediate demand for people in Latin America for February? Well, it's considerable. We will put into training for Latin America in February and March something like 500 or 600 Peace Corps volunteers. And if you'll fill out a questionnaire and say that you're available in February and have the things we're looking for a Latin America project, I think you'll probably go into one. We train generally in about 1,200, 1,300 volunteers in the spring, about 5,000 in the summer, and about 1,500 every fall. But we're certainly looking for people who will be available to go into training in February and March. Married couples, the answer is that we're happy to take married couples without children, provided they both qualify as Peace Corps volunteers. We don't have any dependents in the Peace Corps, except for children born overseas. We have a share of those. But in keeping with the new thinking on the subject, that is, of course, a matter for the volunteer to determine. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. The approximate cost to the volunteer or to the taxpayer? The approximate cost of training a volunteer is hard to isolate, but the cost to the Peace Corps of sending a volunteer overseas comes out to, in most cases, about $8,000 a year. That includes the subsistence payment made to the volunteer, his expenses while he's overseas, which might run around $90 a month. It includes the $75 a month that he's given here and kept for him upon his return. It includes training cost, it includes travel, and the bulk of it is incurred, the bulk of the $8,000 is incurred in the first year before the volunteer goes overseas. I couldn't tell you what the cost of a training program is, but it's something less than that 8,000 figure, and I would guess something like half of it. But it's an expensive education. Training program usually consists of about 13, 14 weeks, 60 hours a week, of which about half is in language training. For volunteers going to Latin America, we try to give them 4 to 5 hours a day of Spanish, or in the case of Brazil, Portuguese. And the same is true of the other languages around the world. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir. Indian languages? They are widely used in Latin America, at least along the West Coast. However, there are very few communities in which Peace Corps volunteers are assigned in which Spanish is not spoken, at least by some people, at least to some degree. But anyone who comes to training for Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, perhaps Colombia, who already has a sufficient knowledge of Spanish, we will endeavor to teach him the Indian language. Here at UCLA, I was pleased to discover this morning there's a professor of Quechua, which is the language spoken by the Indians of Ecuador, Peru, and in large areas of Bolivia. Not very many places in the United States where you can study Quechua. It's not a written language, and it's a very difficult language, even spoken. And I would assume that any Peace Corps volunteers who are trained at UCLA for those countries will get some instruction in that. In general, we try to teach the main language of the country, which is Spanish, and if you have some fluency in it, we'll go on to the Indian languages. Yes, sir. How much censorship? The question is, how much censorship is maintained by the Peace Corps over volunteers in terms of their writing and censorship? The answer, if I'm going to give a short one, is none. But the short answer is not quite going to suffice. Volunteers are, for example, encouraged to write whatever they want for hometown publications, or for that matter, for any kind of publication. And obviously, any letter they want to write, they're certainly free to. But many Peace Corps staffs overseas like to see what the volunteer is writing for publication before he sends it. They're not going to censor it. They never do. But in that sense, I suppose some faint kind of censorship may be imposed. The only reason for that is that they want to be there. They don't want to be hit from the blind side. If some volunteer writes a very critical piece about a country and proposes to send it to the New York Times, the Peace Corps would like to know first, so that when the reporter calls, he'll know what they're talking about. As far as the expression of opinion is concerned, the Peace Corps volunteer is an individual, and he, of course, is entitled to any opinion he has as an individual, although we very strongly discourage a Peace Corps volunteer from having an opinion on a political matter within the country. I think it would be a great mistake, and I'm sure every volunteer understands that the purpose of a volunteer, let's say in Brazil, certainly does not include giving an opinion on whether Party A or Party B ought to win an election in Brazil. But as far as expressing opinions with respect to matters in the United States, we're not imposing any line. Yes, sir. I'm not suggesting that a volunteer in community development work ought not to take sides in a power struggle within a community. I'm talking about the larger national political party issues, as to which it's not necessary to take sides to be an effective community organizer, or at least so we've found. I'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am. What are university graduate students doing beside teaching? They're doing the kind of community development work I was talking about. We have lawyers doing that kind of work and doing it very successfully. They're doing any number of other things. Man's got a graduate degree in engineering, he can be an engineer. He can work in a community in a variety of projects. And with a bachelor's degree. You bet. You bet. People with bachelor's degree make up about 70 to 80% of Peace Corps volunteers. We're not looking for the high-level trained technician. We're looking for people who have an understanding of how you affect your own environment. And that can be acquired easily in the course of getting a university education. I will only say that there's a Peace Corps booth outside here, and I hope those of you who have some questions will ask them out there. There'll be people here the rest of the week. We'll be taking questionnaires, and we'll be giving the Peace Corps placement test. And I hope that some of you who have been perhaps interested by some of the things that have been said here will take the opportunity to examine the question a little further. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mankiewicz, on behalf of the student body, on behalf of the Associated Student Biggers program, we thank you for coming today.